Welcome to Not So New News, where we discover what is hidden in newspapers from 100 years ago. Today's article comes from the town of Whitesburg and appeared in Letcher County's oldest newspaper, the Mountain Eagle. Volume 2, Number 19, dated January 7th, 1909. This reading is from the writings done in 1909. These views are from that time period and do not necessarily reflect the modern views of Kentucky Tennessee living nor its narrator. However, we feel that all historical documents must be preserved for the future and strive not to change one word of the readings. However, if we feel that the readings are too controversial in both political or religious standing, we will either silently put up the article for viewing or will direct everyone where it can be found online. Thank you for your understanding. Today's story is by Olive Winston Gage and was copyrighted by the Ford Publishing Company. This story is now under the Fair Use USA Copyright Act of 1972 for educational purposes. Miss Lolita's Way by Olive Winston Gage. Copyright by Ford Publishing Company. Quote, I would like to know to whom Miss Lolita will give that beautiful pinkish mauve crepe de chine, unquote. Mused Betty Cleveland. She was still called Betty by most who knew her. And, secretly, she liked the abbreviation better than the real name Elizabeth. Quote, Last year, she gave Molly a beautiful church and street tailored dress, and this year she has ordered from blank that perfectly exquisite visiting and reception dress, and one of us will get it. But which one? Miss Lolita's an old dear, and she says it's her way of indulging her love for pretty things. Her taste tells her is too juvenile for her, though she's handsome enough to wear anything. I hope that I will be the fortunate one this year, unquote. Betty dimpled and blushed. Quote, I do hope so, unquote, naively. Quote, I had well asked Daddy for the moon, as for a hand-embroidered crepe, trimmed with flounces and the finest point lace, and hat, gloves, stockings, and slippers to match, and lingerie, handmade, a princess might be glad to wear. I do want that dress, dreadfully, but I will try, unquote. More slowly, quote, to rejoice for the one that gets it. Tracy loves that color. One never does know what decides Miss Lolita in favor of the girl she is playing fairy godmother to. I do hope it will be me, unquote. Betty is a dainty southern maiden of thoroughbred type, colored like a moss rose, and distracting enough to reduce a dozen swains to despair. She, with a half a dozen other girls, met at Miss Lolita's once a week to take lessons in fine sewing from the handsome spinster. In her trim walking skirt and pink shirtwaist of short, tucked China silk, Betty looked almost captivating. And so Tracy Dunlop told her as they walked toward Miss Lolita's handsome home. We will never have another misunderstanding, Tracy, unquote, Betty assured him for the 100th time, and while Tracy might be skeptical, he knew his lady too well to express doubt so soon after being restored to favor. Quote, I hope not, Betty. Think Miss Lolita might let a fellow come and see your charm circle? I say, isn't she handsome for an old girl? Unquote. Quote, you mustn't speak of her so, Tracy. She is our godmother, you know. Did you know I am making Diddy's boy's first short clothes? You should see him. He is such a fine fellow, unquote. Quote, I think Miss Lolita's a brick. Must you go in? Can't I go to the door with you? Unquote. He entreated as they paused at the gate. Quote, no, unquote, said Betty, obdurately. Quote, then wait a moment. Do you care for me a little? Don't you, sweetheart? Unquote. Quote, yes, when you're a good boy, unquote. And with that shaft, she sped up the walk to join Miss Lolita and her flock already assembled in the spacious, airy sitting room. Miss Lolita Houghton was a handsome, well-preserved woman of 55 or 6, with a fine figure and a splendid head of silvery hair, very becoming to her rosy cheeks and bright eyes. Everything about her was sumptuous. Her dress of violet velvet and point lace made her look like a chatelaine of ancient castle, surrounded by her maidens. The resemblance was further enhanced by the carved chair in which she sat enthroned, as it were. By what means Miss Lolita would arrive at her decision regarding the dress, none knew. Was it what they did, or left undone, or what they did to commend themselves to her? They never knew. She did not decide by their skill at needlework or their prompt attendance, so they were totally in the dark. Laggard Betty, exclaimed Miss Lolita playfully, enjoying, as she always did, the girl's fresh bloom. Luncheon will be ready in half an hour or so. Make up for lost time, Betty. Those hand-run tucks, feathered stitched, are beautifully done. You see Tracy tagged along, and when he's with you, the distance is much farther. You get to chatting, you know. Yes, my dear, I know. I have been young. When I'm coming to see these highly prized lessons, my feet are winged, murmured the correct Myra. Yes, observed Miss Lolita, with a quick glance from her gold-rimmed glasses at the quiet figure. You were never 5 minutes late to an appointment in your life, Myra. Her white jeweled hand rested on Betty's curly dark brown head. Encouraged by that, she thought was high praise, the correct Myra proceeded to give her friends a highly moral lesson. Jane, I was so sorry to hear what I heard today. I do not know what you mean, replied Jane. Why, that your brother. You know people talk so much. I heard that he had been wild at college, and your father had sent for him to come home. Brother has been studying too hard, and Papa took him from college, said Jane Pegram. Really? Incredulously. Then the story of the high playing wasn't true. Lucia, I hope your father wasn't very angry at you for being out driving so late last night. A shaft broke and detained us, but I had been home an hour when you drove by with Luther Arkwright. There was general laughter at this thrust, and the correct Myra was covered with confusion at a moment. Then she said, Mr. Arkwright took me to see one of my poor girls who wasn't well. Luther Arkwright paying visits to that kind, ejaculated Deborah. None believed Myra. Judge not. We know the rest. Betty, why did Tracy leave his place so suddenly? Is it true he was dismissed? The face of every girl was flaming, and Miss Lolita spoke with authority. Children, do not recriminate. Let your needles fly, but don't handle any other sharp things. Myra, learn charity before you preach it. Betty, trust that Tracy has a good reason for giving up his place. I do, Miss Lolita. We will go to luncheon. Put up your work. A week later, a vision in pinkish mauve and lace danced into the Cleveland drawing room, and as Tracy caught the girlish form in his arms, Betty exclaimed breathlessly, I got it, you see, the dress I told you about, Tracy. I'm so glad you've got a place on Mr. Brown's editorial staff. Yes, dearest, that is vindication enough. From my late employer, I have a written statement that my discharge was for nothing derogatory. Quote, I was sure of that. Isn't my dress lovely? Look at it, sir, and not at me. Unquote. Quote, it's beautiful, but not half so beautiful as its wearer. Unquote. Miss Lolita sent each girl a handsome bound copy of The School for Scandal, enclosed in a large box. Quote, she'll make the application, or she's not as quick as I thought her. Girlish follies I can condone, but prudery and spite in a girl not 22 I have no patience with. Here comes Betty in her crepe with that fellow Tracy. Ah, well, who can say an old maid is lonely when she has young friends to mother and give a dot to her on their marriage? Come in to your godmother, children. Unquote. Quote, I got it, you see? Unquote. This concludes today's reading of the January 7th, 1909 Mountain Eagle. We at Kentucky Tennessee Living would like to thank you for your continued support as we bring to you the history of the Appalachian Mountains.